Zuber Lawler, first of all, starting with the big picture here, under God, we have 5 offices. We have offices in Los Angeles, where I sit, Silicon Valley, Chicago, New York, Phoenix. We have attorney selectivity standards that are very, very high. We only pick the very best. And so we do great work in the areas of M&A, finance, corporate, lots of IP, lots of regulatory work, FDA work, anti-corruption work, environmental work, so forth, cannabis regulatory work, of course, and lots of litigation. We do this work for a long list of Global 1000 companies that you know very well, Global 1000, Fortune 500 companies in the area of pharma, in the area of energy, financial institutions, insurance, Silicon Valley style tech, if you will. And also at the same time, we've been in cannabis, representing leading cannabis companies for over 13 years, which makes us perfectly unique. There's no other law firm that does this sort of work for this list of iconic global companies that's been in cannabis for nearly that length of time. So our capacity on the higher stakes matters in the cannabis industry is extreme. And at this point, we represent a large percentage of the iconic brands of the US and increasingly the global cannabis industry. I myself focus on intellectual property, and we got into exactly how we got into cannabis. I can actually point to something quite specific. My buddies got into cannabis 13 years ago, and there was nobody really, no corporate law firm, so to speak, that was in the space, right? It was attorneys that were dealing with criminal defense, addressing criminal violations or alleged criminal violations, and they started doing contracts and sort of that sort of stuff. But then when a Series A came up, or an acquisition, or a real partnership dispute came up, they were saying, hey, we'd really like you to handle this. Would you mind? And so I talked to my partners about it, and Josh Lawler, Jeff Zuber, and I, and we had decided, well, it's probably okay to do the legal work. And again, keep in mind, this was 13 years ago. So no law firms corporate law firms were touching it yet. And so that was clearly a decision that we're happy with over a period of time. 5 years later, I don't know, 6, 7 years later, we take a look around and we've got this, under God, great big roster of cannabis clients. We hadn't gone after any of them. It was at that point that we sort of took a look around and said, this is going to be as big as pharma itself. So we decided we were all in. And at this point, I don't think that there are too many attorneys at our firm that don't do a good deal of cannabis work.
Oh, so it sounds like you've definitely pretty much seen it all to this point, then, probably.
We've certainly seen a lot of it. Yeah, that's right. Well, we've seen a lot of it, and it's been quite a ride. Very exciting.
Yeah, so I guess kind of jumping right into kind of the issue that I was reaching out to you about.
Yeah.
So obviously, there's an election coming up, and it seems to be at the forefront of pretty much everything nowadays. Can you describe some of the ways you think this election, the federal election, might impact the cannabis world?
Well, first, I would like to start off by saying, well, prohibition's been a gift in a sense, right? In a material sense, in that if prohibition didn't exist, you and I probably wouldn't be talking, right? We probably wouldn't have the clients that we have. And there may have been, for instance, a movement of the pharmaceutical space into this cannabis space. So the companies that are thriving now, they might not be here. So in that sense, to the cannabis industry as it exists today, prohibition has been, to date, a gift of sorts, right? Because it's allowed this artistry to rise up from such a diverse collection of places. The technological innovation has risen up sort of grassroots style from such a diverse number of places and type of places. So that wouldn't have happened if prohibition didn't exist, right? So it sort of gave time for these other companies to emerge. So that's been a boon. So when cannabis, and I believe it's a when cannabis prohibition goes away at the federal level in the United States, it's important that it goes away in the right way, okay? So if cannabis is rescheduled as opposed to descheduled, then, and when I say rescheduled, of course, I mean moved from Schedule 1 to some other lower schedule on the Controlled Substances Act, right? If that happens, what it could mean is that, well, the cannabis subject matter shifts out of the hands of the current industry and into the pharmaceutical industry, right? That's what it could mean in practical terms. On the other hand, the descheduling would keep it right where it is. It would eliminate 280E issues, meaning the tax issues that minimize the expenses that you can deduct each year from your federal income taxes, and it's a huge burden to the profits of the industry, and so on and so forth. So those sorts of challenges really just disappear very quickly upon a descheduling of cannabis, and it seems that the revenues would stay right where they are, which is with the current cannabis industry. So what we're looking for with the end of prohibition in the U.S. is not a rescheduling, but a descheduling. So first to point that out, and in some sense to date, prohibition has been a gift, and it's important, I think, to acknowledge that. Having said that, it's clear that material changes are on the horizon here at the federal level. I think that there's probably material momentum for a Safe Banking Act, and so we'll see if that happens. But I don't think that we're too far away from that. Whether or not prohibition ends before then is another question. So there's that. I would also say that it seems to me that friends of cannabis may lie in unusual or unexpected places, right? So it's I don't know that this is so much a Democratic issue or a Republican issue. I think it's more often correctly or incorrectly associated with the Democratic perspective. But I'm not sure that that's really so warranted, right? You have John Bonner, who's now a major cannabis proponent, and he was the former Speaker of the House. Mitch McConnell has been a proponent of hemp, and I believe that Trump. I don't think that he has any sympathy for cannabis or cannabis users per se, and frankly, I think he may actually have a negative view of cannabis. Having said that. I don't know that Trump isn't thinking about the votes that he could gain by descheduling cannabis, right? And when I say that, President Trump is ultimately a very political person, and he's got instincts there that have served him well to date. And so I think that President Trump's analysis is, okay, if I deschedule cannabis, will I lose a material number of my base voters? I think the answer is no. In his own words, he could shoot somebody with a gun on Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose a base voter. And so whether or not that's true, it makes the point that I don't think if he would lose a single base voter or any material number of base voters if he descheduled cannabis. And so the second part of the analysis then from his perspective is, would he gain a material number of voters that he wouldn't have otherwise had if he deschedules cannabis? And I think the answer is, of course, a great big yes. So I believe that he's already played that out in his head. Whether or not that convinces him to legalize cannabis, President Trump prides himself on being unpredictable, and so he is to a great extent. So I wouldn't be surprised if we get a surprise before the November election to try and turn the election. That wouldn't surprise me at all. In fact, I think that would be quite consistent with his actions to date, which is to slow down the progress of the Safe Banking Act, to not necessarily come out and be in favor of it, so we could swoop in and save the whole show just before the election. On the other hand, am I counting on that? Absolutely not. Of course not, because he is unpredictable. And if he doesn't do it before this next election, then it really it comes down to who wins the election. If Biden wins it and ends up occupying the White House, then even though Biden has not necessarily said that he's a proponent of a descheduling of cannabis, Kamala Harris has said as much, and I think that the weight of things would veer us in that direction. So I am bullish on the notion that one way or another, cannabis will be at least removed from Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act sometime within the next 4 years.
Okay, so even if, say, President Trump were to be reelected, obviously he wouldn't be looking for votes at that point. But do you think he might still, move forward with that kind of, like he might look at it as a thing that, maybe is just good for the country?
I think he still might. And the reasons why he might is there are a couple reasons. Am I convinced that he would? No, I'm not, to be clear. I have no certainty that he would do something like that in a second term, or at least early in a second term. He might wait until the end of a second term to try and argue for a third term, right? I could see him doing something like that. But putting that dramatic notion aside, there is still an incentive for President Trump, given his own priority set, as I understand it, to deschedule potentially. The reason why he wouldn't, of course, is there's a notion that would anger his base, but I believe that that's illusory, and I believe that Trump views it that way. I think he feels that he himself could deschedule cannabis and without losing any material number of base voters. I think he's already made that analysis, and I think he's correct. So then the question, what does he have to gain? Well, there's tax revenues, and I do think he cares about the money, including the money that the federal government can access. And I think that part of him has said and would say, continue to say, okay, why aren't we taxing this stuff? And so that's a very good question, right? Why aren't we getting this illegal market into a compliant context and then taxing all of it, as opposed to allowing the legal market to continue to run and holding the compliant market back? And so tax revenue is a very big incentive, I think. Another thing is, I do think, again, President Trump prides himself on being unpredictable. This is unpredictable. It says I'm in charge. It says I'm going to do this because it makes sense. It would be very Trump in retrospect if he did it. People would say that makes a lot of sense. That's just like Trump, to do something that bucks the way of things that the Republican Party has done things to date, and he would turn things on its head, and he would take a lot of pride in that. So I think that's another reason to do it, just because it's consistent with his personality. Then another thing is I do think that he likes to be popular. That may be an odd statement, because I don't know that he's viewed as popular, but I do think that he likes to read good press about himself, and he would be seen as quite the visionary for doing it.
Huh, all right.
Is he going to do it? Again, I want to emphasize, I don't know. I really don't. He is unpredictable, and I don't know that he's going to do it. But there are solid reasons for him to do it, including in accordance with his own value set, as I understand it.
Huh, all right. Well, yeah. One of the things too, it seems like legalization, by most accounts, is a pretty bipartisan supported movement. Do you think there's a reason that politicians have been, beyond the presidential candidates, but like Senate and congressional politicians have been kind of hesitant to even vote or kind of discuss the issue openly at length?
Yes, I think that certain folks are blocking it, and I wouldn't be surprised if President Trump is letting that happen so that he could save the day. I wouldn't be surprised if that is or isn't the case. But what I'm saying is, I don't know that we can read too much into the notion that it hasn't happened yet, as far as reading where President Trump is on the issue, right? I don't think we can read that data set and say that data set tells us this or that about President Trump's disposition. With the current data set, which obviously there are folks that are holding the process back, that could be happening because Trump just doesn't like cannabis, doesn't ever want to see it legalized. It would be completely consistent with that. It would also be completely consistent with the notion that President Trump very much wants to take credit for legalizing cannabis, and he wants to have all the credit to himself. And in that case, he would want to have things look as they do now so that he could come on and be the hero and get all the credit. So either one of those two things could be explained by the current data set as I read it.
Huh. So you had mentioned earlier how you're saying you could see him kind of embracing this before the election, just in these next, 5 weeks.
Yeah.
I guess, even though you said you can't say that, it will happen, or you're not holding your breath on it, just on like a scale of 1 to 10, what kind of confidence level would you give that type of move?
You're not going to get me to do that. That's too difficult. I
was just wondering if you viewed it as a toss-up, or...
Do I view it as a toss-up? Do I view it as a toss-up? That's a hard question. So I'm going to take a few moments to think about that. Do I view it as a toss-up? It's so unprecedented out there So I hesitate to take a guess at anything. I hesitate to take a guess at who's going to win the election. I hesitate to take a guess at whether or not the victor of the election will occupy the White House at the end of January next year. It's so unprecedented out there. So I really don't want to say that something's a toss-up as far as whether or not President Trump is going to deschedule cannabis or even reschedule it. What I will say is that I believe that the possibility is material. It's not de minimis. It's substantial. Does it rise to 50%? I don't know about that. But it's material. To be clear, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he does it sometime in October or, frankly, just before the election.
All right. Well, yeah, and I guess one other thing, there's been a lot of discussion, and I guess you could say debate, about if it's appropriate to include cannabis-related bills within the coronavirus relief packages that have been proposed. And Congress, they've included like the Safe Banking Act and different elements within these proposals. But just kind of how do you fall in that? Do you think it is an appropriate thing to include that type of legislation within the proposal? And two, do you think it's something that Congress and the Senate should be, I guess, trying to move forward, given that the cannabis industry has been affected by this pandemic in much the same way as others?
One is a big question, and so the big question is, should our political system work this way, where you've got to do trades, so to speak, behind the scenes in the context of getting legislation for one thing passed by sweetening it with legislation that affects something else that may or may not be completely unrelated. So no, our political system shouldn't work that way. Having said that, it does work that way. So do I fault people for trying to do it now? No, I wouldn't say that I do. And as far as whether or not it should happen, and when I say legislation that makes it easier for cannabis companies to operate and to bank, yes, absolutely. And in fact, I am comfortable making a strong statement. I think the current status of things, where it's happening, everybody knows it's happening. The states are legalizing cannabis. Municipalities are legalizing cannabis. The federal government has said pretty expressly, we're going to look the other way. And in the meantime, cannabis companies can't park their money in a federal banking institution. I think that status of things is objectively silly. And I think that that's a bipartisan notion, right? So absolutely, I think that that should happen. At the very least, that should happen, and it should happen. One, it should, meaning it would be the right thing to happen within the next year. And two, I think that it likely will happen within the next year as a practical matter, regardless of who wins the White House. So we'll see about that. I certainly hope that that's the case, because it's high time that I really didn't mean that pun. Please don't print that pun. But it's about time that cannabis companies were allowed to bank like other companies that do their best to stay compliant with the law as it currently exists. And by that, I mean the state and municipal law, and with a nod to the notion that the federal government has said we're looking the other way on cannabis so long as you're compliant with state and municipal regs.
All right, I got you. And then I guess one last thing to kind of close it. You had mentioned earlier that that you feel like legalization is something that will happen. It's not a matter of when, or not a matter of if, but when. So given that, I guess what scenario in the November election do you think would lead to that happening the soonest?
Good question. I would have to say that if President Trump doesn't do something to move cannabis off Schedule 1 of the CSA before the election, then Biden would probably be the best bet, his statements against cannabis aside, as a function of the folks around him, including Kamala Harris, being very pro-cannabis and pro-descheduling. So I would say that if President Trump doesn't do it before the election, I think the best bet for it happening sooner rather than later is probably Biden.